All right, well, let me be the first to welcome you and thank you for attending our fourth webinar in this year's installment of the Duchess Land Conservancy's Earth Matters webinar series. I'm excited as always to co-host while also learning about landscape restoration from an amazing lineup of presenters this year. My name is Brian Schneedy, and I'm the Outreach and Preserve Manager with the Duchess Land Conservancy. And tonight we're very excited to welcome Kelly Gill, a Senior Pollinator Conservation Specialist with the Xerces Society. Before we get started, my role tonight is to go over some basic logistics about this webinar. After that, our Education Director, Julie Hart, will provide a brief introduction to the DLC and tonight's presenter. First, you are muted and chat is disabled this event to ensure that there is no interruption during the presentation. Second, the raise hand function is disabled, but we do have the Q&A box enabled, which is located at the bottom center of your screen. Questions will be addressed when this presentation is done or by our team during the presentation if possible. Feel free to put those questions into Q&A as we go through the presentation. If there are a great deal of questions, we'll try to combine them based on topics. Third, closed caption is enabled for this event. To turn on this function, please select the CC icon located at the bottom of your screen. And finally, I'd love to hand it over to Julie Hart, our Education Director, who will tell you a bit about the DLC, this webinar series, and tonight's guest presenter.
Thank you, Brian. I'm Julie Hart, an ecologist and educator here at the Duchess Land Conservancy, and I'm so glad you could all join us this evening for another great Earth Matters webinar. Many of you are probably familiar with the DLC, but for anyone who's not, here's a quick overview. The Duchess Land Conservancy is a private, nonprofit land conservation organization located in the Hudson Valley of New York State, and we're dedicated to preserving the farms and forests, wetlands and waterways, open spaces, and wildlife habitats of Dutchess County. We are an accredited land trust, and since our founding in 1985, we've worked with hundreds of landowners and protected over 48,000 acres of land. We are grateful to all of these conservation-minded folks and grateful to our sponsors, the Molly B. Schaefer Education Fund, Labella Associates, StructureWorks, and Mutual of America. We've been learning so much from the 5th season of our Earth Matters webinar series. This season, we're focusing on the topic of land health and asking questions like, what do we mean when we talk about land health? And how can we ourselves be part of making the land more healthy? We'll be asking you to think about your relationship with the land and consider how you can be part of its healing and restoration at whatever scale works for you. I hope that these webinars will help you to connect more deeply with the landscapes around you, to read the stories that can be found in our lands and waters, and to see the complex interactions of plants and wildlife, and to find a new appreciation for the diverse and resilient ecosystems and communities that surround and support us all. So tonight, we're really excited to welcome Kelly Gill, a senior pollinator conservation specialist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation and a partner biologist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. And I got to say, I totally love it that in order to read your job title, I had to say the word conservation 3 times. I think that says a lot about
It's not
what
an
we are
easy
going to
title.
be able to appreciate tonight. So Callie provides technical assistance for implementing conservation practices for pollinators, beneficial insects, and other wildlife. This technical support includes planning, designing, and installing habitat plantings such as wildflower meadows, flowering hedgerows, riparian buffers, and native plant gardens. Kelly also works with agency staff and research partners on the development of technical guidelines, outreach materials, and training programs to guide pollinator conservation efforts. I think most of you are tuning in from the Northeast, where I probably don't have to tell you this. It is very cold. And I think we could not have timed this webinar better because not only are we thinking longingly of those warmer days when we'll see plants growing and insects buzzing, but we're also planning our gardens, our pollinator plantings, and spring management activities. And I hope that tonight's webinar gives you a jump start on all of those exciting and ambitious plans you have for your gardens this year. So with that, I will turn it over to Callie to talk about conserving pollinators in your local landscape, planting for bees, butterflies, and biodiversity.
Okay, how does that look, everybody? Good?
Looks good.
All right, I'm going to close this box over here so I can see my slides. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight, and thank you to the Conservancy for inviting me. I'm very excited as well to talk about gardens and bees and blooms on a cold winter's day. And we have a lot to go through, so I think I'm going to just jump right into it. First, as always, we'd like to start off thanking our supporters, our donors, and in particular, our Xerces Society members. So if we have any members here today listening in, thank you very much. And if we have people that maybe are interested in becoming a member of the Xerces Society, I'll have a slide on that at the end. If you don't know about us, people describe the Xerces Society kind of like the Audubon for insects. We started off as a very small butterfly club way back when in the 70s, and we've been growing by leaps and bounds ever since. Now we have staff across the country working on all kinds of different projects related to invertebrate conservation, biodiversity, agricultural biodiversity, and farmland resilience. And then endangered species and a whole slew of different things. To learn about all of our programs, I'll point you to our website. But just a big overview or overarching view of the Xerces Society is that we're an invertebrate conservation nonprofit. And we work to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. So invertebrates being at the bottom of the food chain, providing us with all these really important ecological functions that make our landscape healthy and resilient. That also supports wildlife and plants all up through the food chain. We are a science-based organization, so the things that we put in our presentations and the publications and all of our other work right on the ground, one-on-one working with people that are installing habitat is science-based. And we work with a really diverse group. So, we're trying to tackle a problem that seems really big from the top down with these grassroots kind of initiatives, all the way up to we have people working on the policy level issues. We get our name from this beautiful little tiny blue butterfly that you see here. This is the Xerces blue butterfly. This is the first butterfly in the US thought to go to extinct to human activity. It is a butterfly that was closely attached in the West, in kind of the San Francisco Bay Area, to sandhill habitat. And as that area got built up and developed, that habitat was kind of wiped from the landscape. And the butterfly this Xerces blue butterfly that depended on the plants there as their host plants is no longer. It is now an extinct butterfly. Unfortunately, there are a lot more insects that are in decline, that are imperiled or going extinct or extinct. And so we have a lot of work to do still. But this is our poster child, so to speak, to remember that these are important and we don't want this to keep happening. All of these insects play an important role. Here's just another overview of the different kind of programs we have at the Xerces Society, everything from pollinators to endangered species, to looking at aquatic invertebrates like freshwater mussels, damselfly and dragonfly larvae. We work across the landscape from large rural farms to land preserves, right down to urban areas in the center of a city. And we have a lot of other community engagement programs that everybody could get involved in. And so I'll show those at the end too, when we go over resources and other ways to help. So I wanted to start off just with a little refresher in why are we doing this? Pollinators are experiencing alarming and rapid declines. And so we know now at least 20% of bumblebee species are threatened. We have the rusty patch bumblebee, who was recently listed as an endangered species, who was a widespread bumblebee in the Midwest and Northeast, and now is experiencing population decline, but also range contractions. So it's still out there, but its habitat is shrinking. The area it occupies is getting smaller and smaller. Over 17% or more of North American butterflies are at risk. That includes species that are very widespread and were very common, like the monarch butterfly. In the East, the monarch populations have declined 80% since the 1990s. So that's alarming because usually nature takes time and things happen over a long period of time, but we're seeing these animals disappear in less than a lifetime. Um, and it's not just a pollinator problem. There are many other beneficial insects at risk. There are many other animals at risk, birds, mammals, the whole nine yards. And what is causing these risks or these declines is a complicated web, a network of risks ranging from habitat loss. So this is the conversion of open space and farmland for development, using marginal land for agriculture, building roads, urbanization, urban sprawl, all of that. We're losing plant diversity across the landscape when that happens, and these native plant communities that pollinators depend on are getting pushed to the edge, and the area of land they occupy are just shrinking and shrinking. And poor land management and stewardship can weigh into that as well. Of course, pesticide use. Pesticides are toxic to pollinators. They don't always just impact the target species or pest they're used to control. We have issues with disease. These animals get sick. This can be from commercial and captive rearing in unregulated spaces. This comes into play a lot when we think about butterflies and monarchs. Moving bees and butterflies around potentially means moving diseases. We're seeing, that our managed pollinators can spread disease to wild pollinators. I do not have a microbiology lab, and that's not my area of expertise, but people are working on that. Invasive species, introduce plants, again, that kind of take over and infiltrate our native plant communities. Some of these invasive species may be flowering plants that pollinators visit. But still, if that's the only thing in the landscape, that bloom time is very restricted. So they only have that food at a very small portion of the season when they're active. Plus, again, that degrades those native plant communities and that diversity that these animals need. Competition with honeybees, when you bring hives into a situation where you have tens of thousands of bees, especially if it's a natural area, there is evidence of resource stripping. So we want to be careful where we're putting and placing our honeybees. Of course, they're important for agriculture and pollination of crops, but we want to be a little thoughtful of that. Climate change, disrupting populations, and plant tolerance to different extreme situations is also an issue. And this may seem like a big problem, and I know that each and every one of us doesn't have the capacity to tackle all of these issues and more. But one thing we can do is look at habitat loss. That's important because pollinators, we can all play a role in conserving pollinators. We can't all play a role in conserving some other animals that are at risks. We can't build backyard polar bear habitat. Some of these larger animals and at-risk birds need acres and acres and acres for nesting and other habitat needs. But pollinators are really accessible and they can be conserved in a small space. Because this is hosted by the Land Conservancy in New York, I just wanted to point out some resources that are specific to New York State. If you haven't looked at the Empire State Native Pollinator Survey yet, it's very interesting. So that survey estimates that there are about 450 bee species in New York State. So a lot of people think of honeybees when they think of bees, but we have all of these native wild species. This report also unfortunately concluded that near 40% of New York's native pollinators are at risk. So that is really important to know. That is just in one state. If we look at all the pollinator species in every state across the country, we're seeing declines. And the worst case scenario and a projection from this study, up to 60% of the state's native insect pollinators may be at risk. So that includes flies and other groups beyond bees that are pollinators or flower visitors. And so about only 3 to 5% of the American landscape is undisturbed habitat for plants and animals. And looking at these pictures here, these are kind of some of the things I mentioned earlier when I said, development, um, the loss of diverse farmland, these monoculture systems that offer little other habitat resources. And of course, our neighborhood landscapes, neighborhood developments that look like this. I mean, you look across these pictures and there's not a whole lot of flowering plants or none. There's no flowering trees, no shrubs, a lot of lawn. And so all of these things, we really want to look at and say, how can we holistically manage these landscapes to create a better overall world for pollinators? Oops, might not. There we go. Oh, went too fast there. And when we think about it, like I said, pollinators are found all across the landscape. And so they really need landscape scale conservation. Now we're looking through that lens. And some of you may say, well, I don't have control of the larger landscape, which is true, right? But you have control of your local landscape, whether it be your backyard, whether it be a community space at your public library, whether it be something at a school, where these can be implemented. So you don't have to own land to help. There are a lot of spaces, and I'll have a whole slideshow of pictures at the end that kind of demonstrate these different ideas. But unless we modify everywhere, the places we live, work, and play, we're going to lose this biodiversity. It is no longer a thing thinking that, these nature preserves that we have the capacity to support all of these insects as the rest of the habitat, surrounding these areas shrinks or disappears. So biodiversity is a cornerstone of a functional ecosystem and resilient landscapes. And pollinator plantings play into this really well because they can perform multiple functions. They could be designed for other conservation needs or concerns. So if you have water infiltration issues or if you have erosion concerns, these plants are really good at addressing those as well. We'll talk about that a little more later. Even small plantings can have a big impact. So you don't need, like I said earlier, huge space to make a difference. And in doing this, if everybody does a little bit, takes a little bit of lawn out or plants a couple more native plants, we're creating connectivity. We're allowing these animals space to move around our landscape and find resources in a way that makes sense for them, where they're not having to, you're not going to the grocery store in Delaware. They don't want to go to the flower market in Delaware. They want that local resource right there where they're living. The more resources around, the less they have to spend energy looking for them, and the more productive they'll be in their life cycle and reproducing for the next generation. So now you kind of know the why, right? This is why we're doing it. These are all steps into thinking about how we're approaching this situation and how you can do something in your own yard or community. So we're going to talk a little bit here about planting for pollinators. So what we need to do is, how do we recognize native bees, right? What are we planting for? Who are these animals? There is a huge diversity of native bees, which means they need a huge diversity of plants and different other habitat needs to meet their life cycle, right? We want to support these animals through their entire life cycle. And that means having nesting habitat as well as protective habitat, now over the winter. So to ensure the next generation. It's really important that we have these diverse pollinator populations. Not every pollinator can pollinate every plant. And so there are different needs by species. We have a lot of generalist bees like this bumblebee here who will go to a variety of different plants to feed. But we have other bees that are more specialized in their diet and they need particular plants, usually from a family or genus. Sometimes we have species that are a species of bees that are tied specifically to one species of plant, right? So we have to think about that when we're putting plants out for building habitat. Their biology and life cycle and their habitat needs, which I'll go through right now. So bee diversity is huge. There are about 20,000 species of bees worldwide. If you look at this is Sam Drogy's photography He's from the USGS. He's a bee researcher and taxonomist. They're available on the web if you want to visit his Flickr page. He allows people to use them, which I think is really great. But this is just one snapshot, and they're pictures taken with the microscope so you can see them clearly and nice and big to see this diversity of different bees we have. They vary in size, color, diets, and life history traits. We have about 500 species in the mid-Atlantic area, and I said earlier about 450 in New York State alone. Most bees are solitary. They don't have a colony. They don't have workers or a queen. It's a single female building a nest, laying eggs, and caring for that nest, provisioning that nest with food. Social bees comprise less than 10% of all bee species in the world. So we know honeybees are social, they're not native, but we do have some native species that are social a little bit differently than honeybees, like our bumblebees, who are social, but they don't have perennial colonies, they have annual colonies. Most of our bees, about 70% of our native bees, the solitary bees, nest underground. Right? And so we think of them as flying creatures out in the open, visiting flowers, but they spend most of their life developing beneath our feet. The other 30% nest in cavities like hollow or pithy plant stems, downed wood, logs that already maybe have some holes drilled in it from other insects. They'll occupy those, and above ground cavities, protected places that keep them nice and warm. Native bees have a strong preference for some native plants, as I said earlier, compared to exotic non-native plants. And so just looking at this is really amazing. But like I said, these pictures are professional. They're blown up big. We can recognize it now as we're looking at the screen. But when we go out to the yard and look at our flowers, these animals are moving around. And a lot of people say, oh, is it a bee? Is it a fly? Is it a wasp? Is that a pollinator? Is that good one or a bad one? And it's really hard to tell one thing, especially if you're new to this. One thing I tell people to look for is that bees have these really fuzzy legs and fuzzy bodies, and that's to collect pollen. So they have these branched pollen collecting hairs. You could see the little dots of pollen here on this bee's leg. And I'll have other pictures. You can see all this pollen here on this bee on the back of it. Those are branched hairs. When they land on a flower, you know, they're purposely collecting pollen with these structures because they're spending more time on the flower. They're really there to feed, but in the meantime, they're collecting all this pollen to bring back to the nest, and they need a way to transport it. So these hairs are branched, so the pollen sticks in these little kind of spikes they have on them. And the hairs also have a little bit of electrostatic charge. So they're like little Swiffer dusters for flowers, which is totally amazing. They're very important to keep this diverse pollinator population. We can't just rely on one pollinator. You know, there are economical reasons for that. There are reasons that affect, you know, human food supply, but really the first thing we should be concerned about is their intrinsic value to nature, right? They're part of biodiversity. They're part of the animals that we share our landscape with. Plants need their best matched pollinator. There are plenty of studies out there that say a diversity of wild bees visit crops and contribute to pollination. And even if you have more honeybees added to the system, if you have diversity of wild bees, in a lot of cases, you don't need those honeybees. They're doing all that work on their own. Some species specialize on certain plants. There's native bees that exhibit different pollination behaviors, like buzz pollination. In particular, bumblebees are good at that. And this is for plants that kind of keep their pollen captive in the flower. It's not readily available like you would see maybe like on a sunflower where you rub that center of the flower and you get pollen on you. Plants like tomatoes have their anthers kind of held in a poricidal anther, and they need to be shaken or buzzed at a certain frequency to let that pollen shoot out. And bumblebees are really good at it. It's a flat C note. So when the honeybees grab onto that flower, they vibrate their thoracic muscles at a certain frequency, which allows that pollen to come out. Um, Plants with bell-shaped flowers like tomatoes and blueberries, and those typically need that buzz pollination. And it's not that honeybees are bad pollinators, but they just don't have the ability, that physiological ability to vibrate at that frequency. So native bees are interacting with the flowers differently than honeybees, and that could be complementary. And we think again, about meadows and wildflowers and these open spaces for pollinators. But we have a lot of pollinators that are specialists. About 30% of the 450 bees in the Northeast are specialist pollinators. And this could include some of those meadow or garden herbaceous wildflowers like goldenrod, sunflower, but a lot of them are forest associated and they're specialists on trees and shrubs. And I think trees and shrubs often get overlooked as people, imagine this kind of meadow landscape for pollinators. So 32% of Northeast bee species are completely forest associated. They spend their whole life in the forest. They're usually active in the early spring when trees and shrubs are blooming and dormant in the summer. So not only they are specialists on certain plants, but in time, they come out and that gives them an advantage. They're specialists on these early blooming plants when a lot of other pollinators are not yet active. And then other bees share the forest with other landscape types. So they may start off in the forest early in the season. Bumblebees are an example of a bee that's active all season long. So they're going to those blooming trees and shrubs earlier on in the season, and then they're moving out into the landscape to other plants that are blooming, like our wildflowers, which tend to bloom later than our forest plants or trees and shrubs in general. And this comes out of some work that my colleague Cass Urban Mead is doing. And fun fact, she couldn't do this presentation tonight, but she was born in Dutchess County. So she's one of your own. So when we look at what we need and what we need to plant our gardens with, there's kind of some big overarching principles. These are the basics. Foraging habitat with an abundance and diversity of pollen and nectar-rich plants. Nest sites, overwintering sites, butterfly and moth host plants. So, not only do we want bees, but we want butterflies. A lot of times they share the same flowers. So you could kind of sort out these high value plants that support not only bees and butterflies, but a whole range of other beneficial insects. Protection from pesticides and other harmful landscape management practices. Another example would be if you have this blooming meadow or old field like you see here, coming in and mowing it when it's in bloom, right? That's not great. Another example is if there were milkweed plants in here, even if they're not blooming yet, if that area is mowed, earlier on in the season, the butterflies could fly away, but the caterpillars that are feeding on the plants cannot, right? And so you're actually directly harming them by chopping them up. So we want to be careful with the timing of things and proper management. So plants, I think, are everybody's first go-to, right? We want plants. We want to pick out the plants. Me too. This is the time of year where I'm getting my nursery catalogs. We're updating things like seed mixes and plant lists with new information. And so it's really exciting to be thinking about plants this time of year, especially when it's kind of bloomy out. Bees need that succession of bloom. So like I said, there are bees that are active all season long, and some are restricted to smaller portions of that season, like spring or summer, or maybe just fall. So in the spring, we need these blooming trees and shrubs and our woodland wildflowers, like you see here, this bumblebee on Dutchman's britches. Moving into later spring, we get things like blueberry and other blooming shrubs coming onto the scene. Some of our early blooming wildflowers like zizia. We don't have too many, at least open kind of upland wildflowers that bloom early. We're relying on some of those forest ephemerals in the early spring. Summer gets a lot easier. There are a lot of choices, milkweed and Joe Pye weed and our penstemons. We'll show more examples in the slides coming up. We'll break down each of these seasons a little more. And then, of course, that glorious purple and gold landscape we see in the fall with our goldenrods and asters. Really important high value resources, not just for bees, but for monarchs that are migrating and need to stop and refuel. I hear a lot of people sometimes say, well, there's a lot of goldenrod out there. And that's good. That's good. That's a good thing. We don't need any more goldenrod are things I hear, but you never know what's going to happen to these plants and how they're going to be impacted. And so keeping that goldenrod intact is a wonderful thing. So here's what this spring, each season might look like as we think about what's flowering in the landscape. Early spring, we have those woodland wildflowers before the canopy closes. Sunlight's coming in, those understory species are blooming, like bluebells. Here we have Claytonia. We have a Claytonia specialist bee that feeds on that and must rear their young on Claytonia pollen. And then there's trees and shrubs. And then I have some examples of those plants down at the bottom. And I could also, I didn't mention this at the top of the presentation, but I'm happy to make a PDF of these slides and send them out for people to have a hard copy. So you could read all the other stuff that I'm not reading as I go through this. Spring to early summer, things like crabapple, blueberry, zizia, this penstemon. Oh, it's a bumblebee magnet. You could just, it's really adorable to look and see the little bumblebee butts hanging out of these flowers because they really get so far in there. So those are some of our earlier spring, early summer. Like I said, in the summer, it gets really easy. Here's some of the heavy hitters. We have pycnanthemum or mountain mint, which just attracts droves of insects. If you have a patch of any of the mountain mints in your yard or at your local, botanical garden, wherever you go to see plants and bees, you could hear that patch buzzing as you approach it. It is just chock full of pollen, or chock full of nectar for bees. Things like echinacea makes a great garden plant. I always recommend it to people starting off because it's an easily recognizable plant. Not, not necessarily truly native to all of the mid-Atlantic and Northeast. It's a more of a Midwest plant, but it is native to North America, and it has not caused any problems that I know about yet. And so it's safe in a garden controlled situation. Milkweed. This is rattlesnake master. This is another plant that's a little more native to the Midwest, but I like to include it because it's such a cool looking flower. Of course, our fall sunflowers and sunflowers. And then you may look at this bottom picture and say, oh no, thistle. We do have some native thistles. This is one of them. This is called field thistle. Unfortunate, and it's a humongous resource. I mean, it is just really prolific nectar producer. It's very attractive to a range of pollinators. Unfortunately, we've eradicated our native thistles along with our invasive thistles because they're hard to tell the difference. And, when people see a thistle, the alarm bell goes off and thinks, oh, invasive species, I have to get rid of it. So we're trying to educate people and bring this back into the landscape, but it's hard to even get people to grow it. And then again, this purple and yellow that we see in fall, which is just so glorious with Joe Pyeweed and ironweed and goldenrod and asters. And there's several other species too that are great fall plants. Of course, butterfly, host, and nectar plants. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Doug Tallamy's work, which breaks down the value of different trees and shrubs for pollinators, which is a huge resource for caterpillars. Oaks, things like prunus, willow. I mean, they just support hundreds of different caterpillar species for butterflies and moths. I'm going to use milkweed as the example here because we all know it's the obligate host plant for monarchs. It's also a high quality nectar plant for tons of other insects. In many studies, it's the top species for attracting lady beetles, parasitic wasps, pirate bugs, syrphid flies. So a lot of the predatory insects that feed on pests that we want to promote in our landscape, they need nectar or pollen during some parts of their life cycle, either when prey is scarce or when they need a boost of certain nutrition. So, for example, lady beetles will feed on pollen when they're trying to develop eggs. They need an extra boost of protein, and that's what pollen is. Nectar is the carbohydrates. So this is the wrong type of milkweed to plant. This is a very common species in garden centers, and not necessarily your native plant providers or nurseries, but it is sold in garden centers. It is not native to the area. It's a tropical species, but it's often labeled great for wildlife. And in its native range, it is. But we do find that it can, especially in warmer areas, maybe not New York, but it's an evergreen plant. It flowers longer. And so it kind of interrupts the migration and breeding cycle because the plant itself has a different phenology than our native plants. It's also shown to support OE parasites, which is a parasite of monarch caterpillars. That could be very detrimental to their health or deadly. And so we don't want to be planting plants that really are acting as a reservoir for disease. We also want to include grasses and sedges. Of course, they're not flowering, but we like to put native grasses and sedges in our habitats. They add another functional group of plants and plant diversity. We include them at kind of a lower rate. Some of them can take over. So if you're working in a small space, you want to choose carefully which type of grass you're planting. And this is kind of avoiding those sod forming grasses that really spread out. We want these native bunch grasses. They tend to kind of stay put and play nicer with other plants. And they're also host plants. So grasses and sedges support a lot of skipper butterflies. They're host plants for skippers. And if you could see this picture on the right here with these bees on the plant, these are native bees and they're male species. So male bees are active for a shorter period of time. They're there to mate, right? So they're very helpful. They do sometimes contribute to pollination, but they're not the ones that are collecting pollen to provision the nest. That's the female. So they move less pollen around from flower to flower. But they do sleep in what they call these kind of dormitories. So you'll see them sleeping. These are sleeping male bees on blades of grass, underneath flower petals. They're using it like a little umbrella. And so they need that space too. It also gives some structural diversity to our gardens and pollinator plantings, small and large. A lot of the wildflowers are very stemmy and they can flop over if they don't have that kind of structure around them. And then we have that visual interest and other added benefits like reducing erosion, helping water infiltration, reaching the ground of water. They have very, very long roots, so they're very good for the soil as well. And the high value trees and shrubs, I mentioned some of these, but I don't want people to forget that these are also valuable. And oftentimes it's a lot easier to plant, especially if you have a small space, one or two shrubs, than it is to plant, a small meadow or a native plant garden. And if you think of, the amount of flowers on a tree or a shrub, they're super floriferous. The flowers are very close together. So it really promotes that foraging efficiency, collecting a lot of pollen all at once and bringing it back to the nest. So we think of them as meadows in the sky. And vacciniums, are blueberries, rubus, viburnum, dogwoods. They're very, very good pollinator plants. So if you have those in your yard or landscape or the local landscape, don't disregard them. Of course, we have oaks, the best, that supports the most Lepidoptera species, moss and butterflies. Cherry is next. And then we have other species like Tilia, which is just a wonderful host plant, not just for Lepidoptera, but bees and other insects alike. So not all plants are created equal. And you may see a ton of flowering plants at the local nursery, but some of these have been bred for different characteristics more desirable to humans, and they've lost their pollinator value. So plants where the flower color has changed, where they have double petals, a lot of them are clones. And this makes nectar or pollen inaccessible, or the plants just don't have them. So, plants that are bred to be pollenless, like the ones that you might see at the florist that people are using for their weddings so they don't get pollen all over their dresses. Um, and also making sure that plants are not pre-treated with insecticides. So that's a really big deal. We don't want to put plants out there that have pesticide residue on them or inside the plant itself from systemic pesticides. That just, obviously creates, a sink, or to be, a little more dramatic about it, a death trap for pollinators. And like I mentioned earlier, flowers aren't the only part of the puzzle here. We also need nesting space for them. So I said bumblebees are social nesting. They're usually in cavities, sometimes above ground or underground. They like things like brush piles, rock piles, insulated areas where they could build their nests. Most of our bees nest in the ground, and bare soil is good, having patches of bare soil, and not on the human scale, because people say, well, if we have a lot of bare soil, that's prone to erosion. Shrink that down to the size of a bee. Bees will nest where there is sparse vegetation, or even in areas where there is a thick mulch layer. I've seen bees come and just move the mulch aside and excavate their nests. And then here's an example of those stem and wood nesting bees. This is a small carpenter bee poking its head out of a raspberry cane. And so this is what that habitat might look like. And of course, it supports other beneficial insects. Looks a little bit messy. So maybe it's not something for the front yard, but if you have something like this in the back, maybe behind the house or garage or shed, it is very valuable habitat. This provides nesting habitat and protection and structure for a lot of invertebrates. And of course, right now where we are, maintaining that winter cover, right? And lawn does not do the trick here. So what do we want to do when we're creating new habitat? Well, the first line of defense is, if there is existing habitat, protect it. And then plan first, plant later. Like I said, thinking about all of these different puzzle pieces so that you're actually building valuable habitat takes time. If you have the resources, if you have the time and the labor and the funding to, install a pollinator garden all at once, well, that's great, but most people don't, including myself. So I have a small urban yard. I add a little bit to it every year. Some things work out, some things don't and need to be replaced. And so, there is a little bit of experimentation to this. There is not a one size fits all recipe, but a thoughtful site-specific plan will give you a higher success rate. So clearly defining, what are your project goals? Setting realistic expectations, whether that's, I'm going to take, 1% of my lawn out this year, or I'm going to plant a shrub or a different plant every year. Assessing the site and inventory. This is really important for the work we do on large scales, but also small scale. You want to pick the plants that match the conditions in your yard. So if you have wet soils or sandy soils, you want to pick plants that are going to thrive in those. If you have shade or full sun, again, those garden principles we're all aware of. As we flip through our catalogs, yes, there are plants that I really love and I want them in my yard. But if I try to force them into a condition where they're not going to grow well, that doesn't mean anything for pollinators, right? They need those healthy plants too. So preparing to plant and staging, and then plant installation, and then management. Those are kind of the process here. So when we're on a site, this is a site where we're planting that was behind a 55 and over community campus. They had a big field that wasn't doing anything. And they had a group there, their environmental club, they wanted to do something for pollinators. This is just a forested edge site where it was very weedy on the slope. And the idea was, well, let's plant for pollinators here. Well, that's a more difficult ask, right? Planting on a slope can be tough. So asking yourself, is this a location where plants are going to do well? Is there pesticide risk? This could be from use on the site you're planting or coming from a neighboring site. The soil slope and drainage, seasonal conditions. Sometimes somebody might ask me to come out and do an assessment and everything looks great in the spring, but then I learn, oh, that area floods in the fall. Okay, that might be a different plant selection. Or maybe we place the habitat somewhere else where it's not exposed to those fluctuating conditions. And then existing habitat, can we connect it to something that already exists? I will say that site prep is very important, even more important if you're planting a seed mix. So for doing a large habitat planting on a site like you see at the top, this is a crop field coming out of retirement. We want that open soil for seeding because the wildflower seeds need seed to soil contact to germinate. Plus, we want to give them a fighting advantage against competition. We can't go out and throw seed on top of a densely vegetated field because it won't get that seed to soil contact. And then it will have too much competition as these plants grow, because seeding wildflowers, the plants take a little longer to develop than annuals because we use the perennial species. Same thing with small habitats. This is a small planting at a park in Philadelphia. We've had them remove the lawn and then plant and mulch to keep the weeds down. So eliminating that existing vegetation, especially if you're seeding, if you're planting live plant materials, especially if it's bigger, like potted plants or shrubs, gallon plants, you could get away with removing, that vegetation right around the area you're planting. Avoiding areas of high weed pressure. Excuse me. This can go from, big spaces right down to these urban gardens, where on the edges you might have weedy areas that have gone unmanaged. And people are inclined to want to fix these areas. And so they want to say, oh, wow, I want to make this area prettier. Well, that's going to take longer because you do have to reduce that weed pressure. So these plants have a fighting chance. We want them to be competitive against other species. So here I'm just going to quickly go through kind of a slideshow of different types of applications. When people think of meadows, they think of these big areas, these larger restoration projects, which we are doing, on different types of landscape. And so if you have large property, this might be an option for you. Oops. I'm not going forward here. Oh, there we go. Did I skip one? Oh, I skipped quite a few. These habitats can also be implemented, in suburban areas. This is a housing complex where it was just a, kind of unmanaged field of grass in the back and it was getting weedy and they did a meadow. I would love to sit on that balcony and look over that instead of a lawn. And this is right in an urban area in Kensington in Philadelphia where a little pocket meadow was planted. So the same principles can scale up or scale down. Roadsides are a huge opportunity. All of these linear areas create connectivity. It's also a little more beautiful to look at the species native to your area as you drive through it. Gives you that sense of place. Parks and green spaces. If you're involved in your community park system, whether it be, county level, state level, or just right in your own neighborhood, a great place to get some folks together and plant a pollinator garden, if you can do that. Rights of ways. Hedgerows, again, I'm always harping on shrubs, but this is a combination of shrubs and wildflowers. It looks big in this picture, but it's just this very small access road going to a property that had, nothing planted along the edge here. So this is a really nice application and what a great way to enter a property. Multi-story hedgerows. If you can't build out, like these meadows, are going out across the landscape, build up. There's a great opportunity here to have those shrub layers, a canopy tree, an understory planting, and it could all be in a narrow linear strip. So if you have, borders of your property or a stream that might need to be buffered, these are good applications. And you don't need a huge space. This is the community center in my town where you see this front area. It was just lawn grass. And so Xerces did not do this, but we were supportive of it. They had somebody in the community that works on kind of landscape design come and help install a pollinator garden. And at first you could see it doesn't look great. There's patches. It looks a little sparse in areas. But I'll show you how it turned out. I like here that there's some little nesting features with this log. They pick native plants with a range of bloom times, just like we would for a larger planting. There are some non-native naturalized species in there, like echinacea and some other ones. There's an area in the back that has zinnias every year. We don't want to plant invasives. And, some species we might put in a garden, we wouldn't put in a natural habitat where it can escape. But we do, for that reason, like to try to stick to natives. So this is what it looked like starting off, and this is what it looks like now. And in the summer when it's blooming, there are people out there taking photos, wedding pictures, just enjoying, the diversity. Walking through this path is amazing. Like I said, you could hear the bees buzzing on these different flowers. They've controlled a lot of runoff coming from upstream where there is a main street that's sloped towards this community center. So it's just a fantastic way to visualize this. There are a few things I will say if you're planting in small spaces that might differ from what we do in larger spaces. Obviously, avoiding overly aggressive native plants, considering a mix of forbs, trees, and shrubs for that diversity, having the multiple bloom periods, planting lower growing plants along walkways or driveways or your front porch. Any area you want to keep open. Some of the taller plants tend to flop over, like I mentioned earlier, so we would want to plant them in the center of the habitat where they have other vegetation around it to support that. And so you don't have to deal with plants, flopping over onto the sidewalk and being in the way. And again, making sure those plants are not pre-treated with insecticides. So here's a little example of some plants, some native, some non-native being implemented into this little garden habitat. And you see a diversity of trees and shrubs and herbaceous wildflowers. Lawn conversion we were talking about earlier as we were getting ready in our practice session for this. We have over 1 million acres of lawn in the US, right? That's a lot. We're not saying to take every blade of grass and turn it into pollinator habitat, but, taking portions of that lawn out, as you see in this house here, right around the border of this little patch of lawn, there's a variety of herbaceous plants and shrubs and some trees in the background. I mean, it's much more interesting to look at. I think it's beautiful. It does not look messy. I know a lot of people are worried about that. If you plant it properly, you could still keep that little patch of grass or a large patch of grass, whatever kind of space you have. If you need an area for a picnic or frisbee or for your dog to go out. If it's purely lawn habitat, it really does increase insects that are seen as pests. So things like grasshoppers and lace bugs and other things that impact your landscaping plants. But if we have this meadow habitat or native plant landscaping, we're supporting a larger web of not only insects, but things that feed on them, like birds. Looking at your community farms and gardens, a lot of our community gardens have multiple, spaces to rent out. Can any of those spaces be occupied by pollinator habitat, to support not only the pollination of your garden crops, but also, for wildlife and habitat diversity. Again, I like to show these photos here because when I tell people, oh, dead trees and snags and brush piles are great, and they're thinking, I don't want that in my garden. But you could put them in there so they're aesthetically pleasing. And I think this community garden here that has this habitat with some of these branches still sticking out from what used to be there is one of the ways to do it. Little pocket meadows in your yard. One thing I do find is those cues to care. And so to keep it looking unmessy, putting things like a little brick border around it, having a clean edge, having, this grass space or paths through it, make it look intentional. Use this picture. I'm sorry about that. I meant to replace it with another one. Office and corporate centers, if you work in a big corporate campus where there's a lot of lawn and they're just mowing and mowing and mowing and watering and watering and watering, taking some of those out and putting in these small gardens has not only shown to benefit pollinators, but also the staff. This is at a corporate center, and the staff there goes out for lunch. They go out and take breaks. They're able to connect with nature, clear their head. It's very healthy. Rain gardens and bioswales. These are like those little parking lot edges where water collects. That can be very important for infiltration, reduce that runoff. It could be filled with pollinator plants. These are just little raised bed and planters around my town that I walk around and take pictures of. There's a monarch club in town. These were just weedy. They were full of trash. They had weeds in them or no vegetation at all. And so they've been working to kind of remediate them and put some life back into it. And people stop and take pictures and sit on the bench. And it's really brought a lot of joy to people. When I'm walking by, I could see people standing there looking at it, where before it kind of just looked like an abandoned area. And we could even scale down to, these sidewalk strips or hill strips or area where, you have your street trees planted. Interplanting those with some flowering plants is also a wonderful option. So again, it doesn't have to be a huge space. We do have to work within the confines of what we have to work with. And then another example of rain gardens and native planting, these plants are also climate smart plants. A lot of them will tolerate, severe drought once established, but also, inundation with water when we have one of those deluge storms that we've been having. And so having these plants here is really beneficial to that too. And I'm getting to the end here. I know I'm approaching 7 o'clock, so I'm almost on time. I did want to talk a little bit about a couple other things. We know that people need help with this. And so we've, over the last few years, started our Habitat Kit program. We have one in the Mid-Atlantic, Northeast. And this is a program where we have, and it's open right now. So I will pass on that website to y'all. But this is a program where we curate different habitat kits. We have about 4 different kits with different combinations of plants for different conditions. And people could write a proposal on how they would use those kits. It has to be a shovel-ready project. They have to show that they have the space, the time, the labor, a planting plan, a management plan. And we do get a lot of proposals, so we run them through a scoring rubric. So everybody is scored the same. And then each year we offer these habitat kits that could have anywhere from 1,000 to 500 plugs, mostly herbaceous plugs and a couple shrubs, to these community groups, parks, schools. It's not for backyard gardening, but it has to be a community space. It's not for private homeowners. But what this program does is it helps Xerces meet our goal as we say, hey, go do this. It helps people source those plants that may not have access to plants, or they may not have the funding, the money, resources to go out and buy them, but they want to do a project and they're able to. And so we partner up with them by providing the plant materials and instructions and some support in planting. And there are, little reports and stuff required, but nothing arduous. The main part is taking care of those plantings long term. Here's what those kits might look like. They do not come with a cat. Um, but having it like that, like we said earlier, that diversity of bloom, mostly wildflowers, maybe a grass or a sedge in each kit. Here are just some of those plantings. This is a green space in my area called Swedes Run Field. It was a grass field. It's a historic site, and so a lot of people visit it to, do passive recreation. This is one of the kits as it went into the ground, and this is what it looks like now. And of course, that sunset just helps helps me sell this. But they've put in, interpretive signage, bird baths, other things. And, people are just in awe of how this has turned out. And they say that there's so many more people coming to use this space and enjoy it. Here's another example of our habitat kit planting. This is at the Cape May Point Science Center. I do spend some time down there during monarch season, especially. It used to be a convent. It used to be a couple things. Now it's a science and art center. And they had this planting here that doesn't look great, and it was ignored for a long time. It wasn't taken care of. They had a lot of invasive species as their foundation plants that they've removed. Planted a habitat kit and continued to add to it, and you can see the results here on the right. This also brings so many more opportunities, which I think is great. Kids are not scared to do this. Adults are more apprehensive. Kids want to jump right in. And so you could see here some kids planting, prepping the site and removing weeds at the schoolyard. And then they're using this, the educators are using this, whether it's on farms or other educational programs at nature centers or right at the school as outdoor classrooms. And just to see these young people engaging with nature. You see here, there's a Girl Scout group they're doing some monarch monitoring, right? They're learning how to take data, they're learning about science, but they're also connecting with nature, which I just think is so valuable as we, live in a society of technology these days. And I think that kind of curiosity about nature is being lost, and it's so important for developmental skills. And down here, you see somebody, holding a little bumblebee, looking at it close up. A couple other things you can do. This is from Heather Holm, Planting Soft Landings. We talked about trees, those keystone trees for Lepidoptera. Host plants, things like oaks. Those caterpillars are feeding up in the leaves, and then when they go to pupate, they drop to the soil often. So having what we call a soft landing around your tree, maybe planting some flowers there, letting the grass grow up, and not mowing right up next to it is an option. And that's just, a small planting around the base of a tree that is already there. And then leaving the leaves. You've probably heard this campaign. We're not saying leave every leaf, but if you can rake them and pile them up somewhere, out of the way, leave some of them, mulch your garden beds with them. We have pupa and caterpillars that are overwintering or pupating in those leaves. Many of them, like you see in this middle picture here, have cocoons that are disguised right as leaves. And so not mulching them, and especially not putting them in a plastic bag and sending them to the landfill, perfectly good biodegradable material is another option. And saving your stems. These are the stems that those bees are nesting in them. And so you'll be able to read this on the slides, but this is a little calendar on when to do those pruning activities. So you can create, you have to create this opening, to cut the top off for those bees to get in. And then best management practices, which I mentioned earlier on that timing and not disturbing blooming plants. And all together, this is what that pollinator friendly neighborhood could look like, right? So you have prairie pockets, you have some shade loving flowers, maybe in these forested areas. Vegetable gardens are great. Tons of bees visit squash and other vegetable plants and fruit trees, flowering medians, all the things I talked about. You know, this is what we want the landscape to look like. And it's not that any one person has to do every one of these, but if everybody does a little bit, we'll get there. Um, and this just has really, really big implications for the larger landscape. So food for wildlife, pest control, plant and seed dispersal by these insects like ants, water quality, soil health, nutrient cycling, clean water, clean air. You know, that they're part of this system. And if they're removed from the system, it will be evident. So we could all make a difference. You know, all the little things we do add up. And that's the same thing when we're faced with a big problem. How do we solve this huge problem? It seems beyond our control or capacity. Well, big problems are made up of a bunch of little problems that we could attack, right? So those small actions matter. My last few slides here, if you want to join as a member, you know, the work we do depends on everybody in making a difference. Even if you can't do any of these other actions, if you become a member and donate to the Xerces Society, that helps us continue our work, especially in trying times where funding can be, um, you know, scarce. So please join. Members do benefit from a lot of things. They get publications, our Wings magazine and other things to keep them engaged, and they learn about opportunities. We do have an ambassador program as well. You could join our Bring Back the Pollinators initiative. We're actually rebooting it soon and take the pollinator pledge. That's something that you know, that's self-governed on your own. You get a blip on our map on our website, and people get to share garden photos, and it's a way to maybe connect with other people in your area. Helping us with our community science programs. So we have a bunch of those. If people are interested, they could contact me, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But that's helping us collect data and observations. One thing about these animals is that there are some that we don't know enough about, and there are some that are so widespread, you know, our staff alone can't possibly get enough boots on the ground to learn more about them. And the more we learn, the better conservation decisions we can make. If you're not already involved in Bee City USA, very much like Tree City USA, we have a program where you can apply to be a Bee City or Bee Campus. There are requirements, but this is, you know, getting a group of people together in your community, working with your community leaders to make changes, whether that's planting habitat or, you know, influencing the way your town or city might use pesticides. So that's a great program to get involved in. We have affiliates all across, I think almost in every state now, and in some in Puerto Rico and other places too. So please look at that. If you work with kids, we have a wonderful kids program called X Kids or Xerces Kids. Kind of like X-Men, but X Kids for insects. And we have workbooks available in English and Spanish. And there's activities in there that work through, you know, different kind of science lessons targeted for grades 3 to 5. It could be done at individuals or groups. So please check that out. And then you get an X Kids badge when you complete the mission there. A few new things. We have a podcast now, Bug Banter. Please check it out. It is phenomenal. Not only do our staff, who are so diverse and intelligent and interesting and engaging, tell great stories, but we've had a lot of really wonderful guest speakers as well. So you could get that wherever you get your podcasts. And then following us on social media, sharing our information, you know, getting the word out is also important. Education is such a huge part of conservation. It can't be left out. And speaking of that, we have tons of resources. If you visit our website, We have a pollinator conservation resource center, and we also have a publications library where you can find planting guides, habitat installation guides, everything from building meadows to home gardens, um, fact sheets about pesticides, different pollinators, different plant lists for different regions. There's just a humongous amount of information. It's almost taken over our webpage. We are reorganizing it to make it easier to find. So if you're looking for something and you can't find it, chances are we have it. You can reach out to me directly and I'll get it to you. And I think I'll stop there for questions.
Thank you, Kelly. And wow, you know, at this time of year, I always forget just how much I appreciate the color green. My
Yeah,
eyeballs are just drinking in all of these pictures and so happy to see.
me too. Me too. Definitely.
So we'll be sending a follow-up email that'll have a link to the recording of this webinar. And Kelly, if you could send me the PDF of the presentation and your
Yep.
resource list, we can include that as well. So people will be able to follow up on all of this stuff on their own and help you put this
Okay.
new knowledge into action. So it looks like we've got a good amount of questions in the Q&A. Keep putting them in there. We'll get to those in a second. Before we launch into that, I wanted to let you know that registration is now open for our next webinar, which is going to be on Wednesday, March 4th, and we'll be focusing on our local landscape right here in the Hudson Valley. We're going to have some speakers from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and the Hudson River Foundation. They'll be sharing an overview of the 2025 State of the Estuary Report, which is going to speak about the environmental trends in the Hudson River and its watersheds, an area where many of us live in the Hudson River watershed. So we hope to see you all there next month. And let's get those questions opened up. There's a lot of great questions in here. I hope we can get to all of them. First question is, are bee hotels a good thing? And if they are used, should you replace the tubes in them each year? And at what time of year would you do that?
Yeah. So bee hotels, there's a balance, right? They're a great learning opportunity to put in a garden and show people how these bees nest and how it's different, than maybe a honeybee, and why they need these, stems and things in their habitat. Our first recommendation would be to plant the plants that provide that. Having one bee hotel is fine, or maybe two if you have a large area, but you want to make sure they're constructed properly. A lot of the decorative ones you'll find in a garden center are not. The tubes aren't long enough. They just don't make sense for what those bees need to nest. So the diameter of the tube and the length matters. Um, and we try, and if we're going to build them, we say, well, can you build them with natural materials? So maybe cutting down things like, if you have a bamboo patch and you're getting rid of the bamboo, yay, use that, use that. Those natural materials degrade on their own. And so they tend to accumulate less pests and disease. If you're using artificial tubes like cardboard tubes, you could get straw inserts for them and swap those out. But yes, if you're using material that does not degrade quickly, you do want to swap those out because they will build up with pests and disease and even little mites that eat the pollen and take it away from the developing bees. So having a few, having them spread far apart is great. Having a lot of them close together, similar to birdhouses, they need to be managed. And we do have fact sheets on our website on how to build them and construct them.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, there's a lot of good information on different styles of bee hotels to build. The next question comes in, what tree species are the best kinds of logs to use for nesting bees? Do conifers work?
Yeah, so both will work. It depends on the bee species. Um, you know, uh, Conifers are great if they're a lot of these bees are kind of nesting in like wood that is decaying. So might not be a freshly cut log. but one that is kind of decaying over the time, soft wood so they could bore into it or bore into existing holes. Um, so, some bees might have a preference, especially those forest associated bees, but, making a snag that would be, any kind of woody, yeah, any kind of woody trunk.
And the next question is, I think this is referencing back to that great photo of all those kids planting pollinators in their schoolyard. And the question is, how to encourage pollinator-friendly school landscaping when parents are afraid of bee stings harming their
I'll make a
children.
butterfly garden. No, that is a concern. There are people who are allergic, and we want to be sensitive to that. But I think sometimes that gets a little bit out of hand. Bees, is, so the bees that and what usually is stinging people that's detrimental are wasps, social wasps. Social bees will sting as well, but really that's if you're disturbing their hive or their nest. Our solitary bees, they are not guarding a hive. It's that single female. So, she doesn't have a hive to protect. It's a defense mechanism. And most of these native solitary bees don't sting or can't sting. And there's no evidence, compared to honeybees, of a native bee sting causing like anaphylaxis or something like that. So, it's usually feels like more like a bug bite. So just kind of educating, hopefully trying to educate the parents on this, at that, kids could run into a bee anywhere, right? And if bees are on the flower, they're certainly not guarding the flower. They are docile, even a wasp collecting pollen, they're pretty docile. So unless you actively go and grab it, then, your chances of getting stung are pretty low.
I love it. More information to get my kids to not be scared of bees as we tend to our pollinators.
Yeah, and collecting them in those little jars. I mean, I have little vented jars, and I work with kids groups who are terrified, oh, they're screaming. And then by the end of the program, they're climbing on me, they're asking for jars. I'm seeing them sneak jars home with them. And so just getting over that and kind of, getting a close look in a safe way really helps just to kind of reduce that stigma.
For sure. And I think, yeah, differentiating between bee species and what ones are aggressive and not is helpful
Yeah.
as well. Awesome. Thanks, Kelly. So next question is coming in from someone who is mainly invested in community vegetable gardens. They plant hyssop and catmint as pollinators.
Mhm.
You didn't mention them. Am I using the wrong pollinators?
Yeah, well, we do plant, we have native hyssops. And I have catmint in my yard that was a legacy from the person that lived here before me. And it was a very healthy, large patch, and I do keep some of it. When we're talking about some of these plants spread, and it's okay to go and edit, you know, pull some out, make some room for something new. But yeah, both of those are good pollinator plants in a garden situation. We have a lot of other kind of our culinary mints, oregano, chives, things like that are great pollinator plants. So long as you're letting some of them bloom um, before you harvest those. Yeah.
That's a good answer. I think that's really helpful. The next one's actually not a question so much as a comment, but when you're talking about doing these kind of community plantings, encouraging folks to get the children involved and pair up with local environmental organizations,
Yep.
botany and horticulture clubs, and even land trusts can help with those kind of plantings. So thank
Yeah.
you for
Yeah, a
popping
lot
that
of our
comment in.
community programs, I'm surprised, and it's heartwarming that there are a lot of youth involved, and they're excited. So keeping that curiosity going, I couldn't agree more.
And that's, oh, no, go ahead, Brian.
Okay.
Sorry.
So the next person has a question, kind of a large question, because I bet you have a lot of advice, and we'll be following up this presentation with an email with a lot of the links that you've mentioned here, but what are some good online resources available for homeowners to consider for converting lawn space into flowering plant space or escapes for pollinators?
Yeah. So on our website, we have a garden section, but you might want to explore the Bee City website that I showed, because that program is really targeted to, residential areas. They have information on lawn reduction, but also ways to, I don't want to say deal with, ways to communicate with things like HOAs, and maybe change some of those rules. I know that's can be a struggle for some people. Otherwise, you're welcome to reach out to us directly. These are the kind of things we help with. And so, if you have questions, if you're looking for resources, if you develop a plant list and you want somebody to review it, send it our way. We're happy to help with those questions. A lot of times they're site specific, and they need a little more thought put into them. So I don't have a big blanket answer, but we do have a lot of that information on our website, including things like, how to remove your lawn, how to start that process, the equipment available, the different methods you can use, some case studies as well.
And speaking of reaching out directly, the next question is actually asking a regional question about your habitat kits. Is there a habitat kit program for Maryland? This is someone who's out in Western Maryland.
Western Maryland. So we haven't gotten out to Western Maryland yet. One of the things with these programs is that, sometimes we are, I want to say confined, but the geographical scope of them is set sometimes by the funding we get. And so the program this year is really targeting urban centers and underserved communities. So New York City, Philadelphia, Southeast Pennsylvania, New York City metro area, Philadelphia metro area, Trenton, Camden, and those places that are really in need of access to, support for this. That's not to say our Habitat Kit program is growing. California started it, Mid-Atlantic came next, and now we're doing it in other places across the country. And so we hope that we can get this, we could get more of them up and running to cover a larger geographic area, but it does depend on funders.
Yeah, sounds like a large undertaking, big program to be spreading, but the further it goes, the better, right?
It is, exactly. It is. It really is a wonderful program. And, when we have our distribution days, the people that come and pick up their plants, there is nothing better about my job than seeing people, how happy they are to get plants. I mean, it makes me almost want to cry.
That's so cool. Yeah. That's awesome. Okay, well, the next one is kind of a statement, but maybe you can chime in a little bit on the benefits here. So this individual keeps several bird baths available year round. Two are heated in the winter for the birds. My surprise was how many butterflies and bees visit the baths in warmer seasons. Do you recommend a water source for pollinators?
Yeah, so these animals drink water. Um, I often see, in water sources like bird baths, hot tubs, even chlorinated pools, honeybees are drinking that water. So you'll see them congregate around. A lot of bee species get their water needs from nectar, but sometimes they supplement it. So leaving it there, so long as I'm sure you're cleaning it out and managing it for the birds. Um, so that's a great way to do that. And you'll even see it, butterflies drinking out of puddles. It's called a behavior called puddling. And what they're doing, they're getting a little salt, right? Male butterflies drink that, drink the salt. And when they go to mate, they give that salt as added nutrients to the female as a nuptial gift. So yeah, so having a water source is good. When we talk about bees, we try to keep it shallow and put like rocks or something in there so they don't drown, so they could climb out. But yeah, good point. I didn't mention that at all. I usually do mention that as another addition to a garden, that and a bench or a chair where you could sit and just watch and enjoy.
And it's such a simple thing that really anybody can
Yeah,
do anywhere.
yeah, it
Yeah.
could be any kind of container. Here where we're close to the shore, a lot of people use little seashells and things like that. So it everybody likes to decorate.
And so the next question is kind of follow up on a previous one. You had mentioned reviewing plant lists for folks to provide some advice on what they're working on. This person's asking, does Xerces or another local organization provide on-site analysis for landowners interested in developing and preserving pollinator-friendly habitats?
So yes, the main part of my job, and the people on my team is to go out in particular. Now, these earlier you learned about the part of my title that's NRCS partner biologist. So we work with, government agencies that are providing payment incentives for conservation. And we do visit these and help them from A to Z with planning for wildlife habitat. So that includes everything from the site analysis right down to a full-on conservation plan, from planting to management with the plant list and everything. So we definitely do that for larger sites. To fulfill all the requests we get for, homeowners and private sites like that, it's a little bit more difficult, but we certainly can answer questions to our capacity. And if it's a bigger site, potentially we can do that under our current funding, right? So, I have to report what I'm doing, and it has to match some of the funding pools we have. Um, Now, that's not to say that we can't give advice, or we sometimes, might pop over to a site if we're in the area already. So yeah, reach out to me and we could talk about that more.
Well, yeah, I bet you got a lot of emails requesting for
No,
assistance.
well, I wish I wish we could do it all. I really do, but yeah, we do have to be careful on some of that, because we have to report back to our grant people.
Of course, of course. I am going to give the warning that we have just a couple minutes left here, but we have some pretty good questions left too. So I want to try to get to a couple more. This one I found interesting. Could rooftop meadows also prove beneficial, or does elevation change things?
That's a good question. So we have done some rooftop plantings and green roofs, and the bees find their way there, right? Especially the bigger bodied bees. So bumblebees, honeybees are bigger bodied, solitary bees. We do have some teeny tiny ones that they just don't have a big flight range in general. They don't go far, and they probably don't go high up, um, you know, tens of stories. But yes, we do, and we see monarchs on patio, plantings of milkweeds and things like that. So they know how to find it. These flowers give them cues, and they, it's like if you plant it, they will come. So yeah, I would encourage, rooftop containers, the whole nine.
And kind of related to that, in terms of getting up close and personal with the bees, here's a question asking, is it safe to pet the bumblebees when they are visiting flowers, or the male bees when they're sleeping in the flowers at night?
Yeah. So so if you go up to a bumblebee on a flower, especially if it's in the morning and a little chilly, and you pet it, it will raise its hind leg and you could kind of give it a high five. Um, I wouldn't interact if you see, like, bumblebees flying into their nest, a whole lot of them. You want to leave the nest alone. But one thing about male bees, including bumblebees, is that they don't have stingers. No male bees have stingers. It is a structure that female bees have, that over time evolved, but it's really an ovipositor that became a defense mechanism. And so male bees don't have that. So when you see like the male carpenter bees, the real buzzy ones that are kind of like guarding the holes around your shed or garage, you can grab them. They have a yellow patch, a very noticeable yellow patch on their face. The females are out visiting flowers and doing work. The males are just buzzy and kind of bumbly. So if you want a real good party trick at the barbecue, you can reach up and grab one. They don't sting at all.
That's excellent. I actually had a friend in elementary school who would grab bumblebees, put them on a piece of paper, and carry them around and freak every kid out, including
Yeah,
myself.
way back in the day, I used to work on a farm as a research farm as a beekeeper, honey beekeeper. And when we would get a failed hive, it would often be full of drones, male bees. And we had these littler hives called nuke boxes that we put in these pollination cages, really with plants in them. And we used to put the nukes full of male bees in people's car. Oop. So
That's excellent.
that was always funny to see the reaction to that. But yeah, I mean, you
Yeah,
want to be careful, but they're
sure.
not as aggressive as wasps.
Yeah. So we have a couple more questions coming in, but we are kind of running out of time here. Do you mind answering one more, Kelly?
But
Okay. So this individual is kind of a loop back to something you're talking about or earlier about like disturbing nests versus disturbing single bees. But this individual has a number of ground nesting bees. They want them in their woodland garden, but have been problematic. Their nest sites are hitting one of the plants, so they don't know where they are. Maybe they're getting stings by them or just, accidentally disturbing a nest. But is there anything they can do other than avoidance to live in tandem with the bees?
so I'm willing to bet that those are ground nesting wasps, yellow jackets, or a social wasp, where where you see a lot of individuals flying in and out of, a single or entrance. And they could have multiple entrances. Our ground nesting bees, when you see an aggregation of them, it's usually in the spring, and then they are, dormant in the summer. So you might see a lot of activity in the spring, individual. They look like a lot of ant hills. Those are solitary ground nesting bees, totally docile, don't sting. Later in the summer, so wasp colonies start off small and they build up their numbers as the summer goes on. And later in the summer, they'll be coming out from under rocks or holes in the ground. And there are a lot of them, and you can get, stung multiple times by wasps, by multiple individuals. And so, that sounds like a wasp problem to me. Um, People have tried different things like flooding the holes and doing other things. Sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. It's just a matter of being careful, understanding that they're going to be more aggressive later in the season when their food sources are more scarce, and those wasp colonies are annual, so they'll all die at the end of the year. So sometimes just waiting it out, and then sometimes, you know, it depends, but they don't always reoccupy the same nest next year. Um, but yeah, I'm happy, other than, a lot of people go the drastic route.
Mhm.
And, don't dump gasoline or anything into your ground and try to set them on fire, do anything crazy like that. The problem usually is just temporary. But I do understand. I mean, we get them, we can't control sometimes where these animals live. And sometimes it puts us, at a little bit of risk. And sometimes it puts them at a little bit of risk when they pick a bad place to nest.
For sure. All right. Well, Kelly, thank you so much for your time tonight. I know that I'm anxious for the snow to melt so I can see the ground again. And this has made me even more so anxious to get started on my spring work. So,
Start planning it now. Get your pen and sketch pad out, and we're here to help. We have lots of resources, and I will follow up with the slides and the resources. this week.
Yeah, and yeah, just as a reminder, folks, there's been a lot of requests for the slides tonight. We will follow up with a link to those and a link to a lot of the things Kelly has mentioned tonight. There's too many things on the Xerces Society website to list
There's a lot.
everything that's been talked about tonight, but we'll do our darndest. And yeah, feel free to search the website. There's a lot of great resources and educational sources, great things for youth education as well. Anytime we do anything pollinator related, I go to your website first. So
Oh, fantastic. Yes,
yeah,
yes. And we do events and programs and things like that too. So if you're looking for representation at, an Earth Day or Green Fair or something in your community, please do reach out to us. If a staff member can't do it, we do have a whole cohort of trained ambassadors.
Hmm.
So those are people that do events and talks for us. A lot of them are retired naturalists or retired professors that like really know their stuff. So yeah, we're trying to grow as much as we can and trying to fulfill all the requests we get because we know each and every one of them are important, but it can be hard.
Yeah, yeah. Spread thin, right? Well, great to know. And we'll be sending out a follow email up from this event. And we hope to see you all on March 4th for our next webinar in the Earth Matters series. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Julie and Doug. And good night. And thank you, everyone, for attending.
Good night.
Good
Thank you.
night.
Thank you, Kelly. Have a good night, everyone.
You too. Thanks.